its rise has been absolutely amazing. In 1949, 2 years after we got independence, China 1949 and India were more or less on par on all indicators, give or take, say 10%. But since then, China's rise has been absolutely amazing. 625 million people have been lifted out of poverty in China. China's GNP today is $5 trillion, which is over 1/3 of the US, about 4 times that of India, and still growing very, very strongly. And on other indicators too, literacy, women's health, on modernization, science, education, the indicators are all extremely positive. That is on the one hand. On the other hand, the political system of China is something which we in India and others in the world look at and we wonder about it. What is it? Some people say it is authoritarianism, a dictatorship. Well, it looks like that, but is it that? It also has, funnily enough, some features of a democracy. Is it a state which is just a kind of large continental mass? It's more than that. It's a civilizational state with an ancient history, but also very modern with people. If you go into China today, for example, most of the women are dressed in Western clothes. This is a big difference you notice from India, where our women are mostly dressed still in traditional clothes. So it's an amazing mix of the ancient, the modern, the continental size, the civilization. It's got features of everything, highly complex and complicated, which, if you think about it, is exactly what India is also. So if people who live in a complicated country can deal with one complicated country, can they understand another complicated country? Do we know the mechanics of understanding complexity? This is one approach I want to look at when I go through this. Now, this kind of paradoxical country with so many features is not easy to understand. And therefore, the rest of the world, when it has looked at China, has kind of somewhat simplistically, I would say, tried to assess what its future could be. And simplifying matters, when they ask, well, can China go on like this? Can it keep growing at 9%? Can it do this forever? There are two broad schools of thought which have emerged, basically from Western scholars. The first school of thought, and the title of one book will say it all. It was a book by Gordon Chang, who wrote a book called The Coming Collapse of China. The year was 1999. We all know it didn't happen. So he got egg on his face. But what happened was that, and this book was all about the financial collapse of China because of bad debts and NPAs and all the rest of it. But lo and behold, after 7 or 8 years, 2008, what really happened was the financial collapse somewhere else, quite far away from China. Now, this was against all logic. After all, bad debts, poor governance, cronyism, all this kind of thing which was supposed to be happening in China should, by all economic logic, made this stuff happen in China. Not on Wall Street, not in Europe, not in Greece, not in poor little Iceland. But that's what happened. So here is another paradox. But then there is a second school of thought which said, well, it's not going to collapse, China is not going to collapse, but what is actually going to happen is that the tension of this sort of growth and increasing pressures for democracy is going to lead to a lot of kind of huge tensions and kind of contradictions. And on the one hand, it will be somewhat like somebody walking on a tightrope. The Communist Party of China driving this huge country on this rapid growth path and also trying to cope with the hopes and aspirations for a freer press, for a freer media, and so on, is going to be trying to juggle all this together, and it's like a man walking on a tightrope. How long can he walk? How far can he walk? 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, 10 kilometers? There are people who cross the Grand Canyon, but can it go on? So this school of thought says, well, nothing is going to happen right now, but lo and behold, in the future, something is going to go wrong, and especially if there is some sort of external shock, then watch out, boys and girls, the story is going to come to a sticky end. Well, as I said, one kind of shock happened, nothing happened. The SARS shock happened, nothing happened. So there is something further that is happening there which we have not quite understood. Now, as I said, China is a country which cannot be easily understood in a Western model. So if you start looking at this, and I use the word Western only because most of the thinking and most of the literature to which we have access here emanates from the West. So it cannot be understood easily in using Western terms and Western concepts. The reason simply being that China is too large. It has got its own history and civilization which go back over 5,000 years. It has got a weight of tradition and a weight of culture over this huge period, and it has been a successful country for centuries, if not thousands of years. In fact, Angus Madison, an economist, so that should be quite credible, Angus Madison has said that until the year 1820, China had 33% of the world's GNP. India had 25%. And in the years earlier, China's share was a little more or a little less. It is from 1820 onwards that China's share started dropping, because it was then onwards that the Western powers and Japan together started a process of what might be called semi-colonization of China, and China's share rapidly declined. At about the same time, of course, India was equally and more directly under British colonialism. India's share also declined, and by the time 1940 had arrived, I think both countries were around 5% or so. We climbed our way back and are once again kind of, hopefully, both countries are hopefully on the way up. But because China is so big, continental size, so large, with a huge population, with a tradition, a culture and civilization, what we can say is China is not going to follow the rules and paradigms and thought process laid down by anybody else. And therefore we have to seek to answer this paradox by looking at China's own thought process and try and understand China in her own terms. And if one does that, and if one tries to probe into the mind, as it were, of China, then we have to start from the fundamentals of what makes China Chinese. And a lot of that, in fact, a huge amount of that, comes from the gentleman that Sudhindra has mentioned, figures in the poster right up in front and right here, and that is Confucius. Now, Confucius, a very remarkable person, actually started life